September 21st, 1327. Behind the cold, silent walls of Berkeley Castle, a king waits in chains. Once crowned by God and crowned in gold, Edward II now lies broken, his body bruised, his dignity stripped. In the dead of night, two men enter his cell. They carry no sword, no poison. Instead, they bring a horn and a red-hot iron. What follows is not simply an execution, it is a performance of symbolic cruelty, a death crafted to leave no wound but speak volumes. His screams are muffled, his body left intact, his soul torn from him by fire and silence. By morning, England has no king, only a corpse, contorted in agony, and a story that will haunt history. But was it truth or legend? Edward of Caernarfon was born on April 25th, 1284, into the shadow of greatness. The youngest surviving son of Edward I, known to history as the Hammer of the Scots, heir to a brutal legacy of conquest and kingship. But from his earliest days, it was clear that this prince would not mirror the father who bore his name. Where Edward I was iron-willed, martial, and feared, his son was gentle, curious, and drawn to the pleasures of life far from the battlefield. He preferred swimming to swordplay, crafts to crusades. He mingled with laborers, worked beside peasants, and delighted in the company of those beneath his station. To the king, this was not innocence, it was weakness. Disgusted by his son's softness, Edward grew increasingly cruel. In one infamous outburst, he tore fistfuls of the boy's hair from his scalp. Furious that the prince dared ask a royal title for a favorite companion, the young Gascon noble Piers Gaveston. Between them stretched a chasm of expectation and disappointment. One built empires with blood and steel. The other would one day lose one with silence and love. The seeds of a tragedy were sown not in betrayal, but in difference. He was everything the young Edward was not: bold, witty, magnetic. Piers Gaveston, a knight of modest Gascon origins, entered the prince's household as a companion. But what began as friendship quickly deepened into something far more dangerous. Chroniclers would later call it a bond beyond all measure, a covenant of indissoluble love. Whether chivalric ideal or forbidden passion, their intimacy soon consumed the English court. When Edward I exiled Gaveston, hoping to sever the tie, the future king swore to bring him back, and did so at the first breath of freedom. Upon ascending the throne in 1307, Edward II recalled Gaveston immediately, granting him the title of Earl of Cornwall, a dignity traditionally reserved for royal blood. Worse still, Gaveston was lavished with gifts, influence, and a role in the coronation itself, carrying St. Edward's crown in open defiance of noble protocol. The court was scandalized. The Queen, Isabella of France, was humiliated. Her jewels, gifted by Edward, were seen in Gaveston's possession. The nobility seethed, seeing not a king, but a puppet entangled in desire. By 1312, their fury turned lethal. Gaveston was seized by rebellious lords, mocked and butchered beside a quiet road. A lover, perhaps. A threat, certainly. A warning, undeniably. She was just 12 years old when she arrived in England, a princess of France, daughter of the formidable King Philip IV, offered in marriage to secure peace between rival crowns. Isabella of France was young, but she understood her role, to become Queen of England, consort to Edward II, and mother to his heirs. But from the moment of her wedding in 1308, it was clear that she had entered not a marriage, but a triangle. Edward lavished his attention not on his bride, but on Piers Gaveston. During the coronation festivities, Isabella was ignored while her husband clung to his favorite. Even the jewels meant for her wedding gift were rumored to have been passed to Gaveston, a private insult made painfully public. The court whispered. Foreign envoys raised eyebrows. And Isabella, a child queen in a strange land, swallowed the first taste of humiliation that would come to define her early reign. In her husband's eyes, she was a political obligation. In her own, she was a queen without power, without dignity, and increasingly without place. The seeds of resentment took root early, And as Edward's obsessions deepened, so too did Isabella's resolve. A humiliated queen, history would learn, is never just a victim. By 1312, the patience of England's nobility had worn thin. Piers Gaveston, mocking, lavish, and dangerously close to the king, had become more than an insult. He was a threat to the very structure of aristocratic power. His influence corrupted court appointments, diverted royal favors, and emboldened a king who refused to see the storm gathering around him. The barons acted. Led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, they seized Gaveston while Edward was away. There was no trial, no appeal to justice. The verdict had already been written, in blood. On a desolate stretch of road near Warwick, Gaveston was mocked, stripped of his titles, and summarily executed. Stabbed and then beheaded, his body was left exposed as a message to the king. The crown would not protect favorites. Edward II was shattered. Upon hearing the news, he reportedly collapsed in grief, refusing food and speech. The man he had loved, whatever the nature of that love, was gone, murdered by men he could not punish. But Edward would not forget, nor would he forgive. In Gaveston's death, the king's bitterness hardened into resolve. The scars left by the blade that killed his favorite would not heal. They would fester and return with vengeance. In 1314, Edward II marched north with an army to crush the defiance of Robert the Bruce and reclaim English dominance over Scotland. What followed was not victory, but humiliation. At the Battle of Bannockburn, near Stirling, the English were routed, overwhelmed by a smaller, more determined Scottish force. Knights drowned in marshes, banners fell. The king himself fled the field, barely escaping with his life. The defeat shattered the illusion of strength. Territories won by his father were lost in a single day. Edward's reputation, already weakened by scandal, now reeked of failure. The nobility questioned his judgment. The commons suffered the consequences. Scottish raids devastated the north. Confidence in royal leadership crumbled. Worse still was the state of the royal finances. The treasury, once filled by Edward I's conquests, was now bled dry by favoritism, court excess, and poor governance. Taxation rose, resentment deepened. And yet, the king learned nothing. Rather than restore order, Edward repeated his gravest mistake. He found another favorite. Hugh Despenser the Younger emerged to fill the void left by Gaveston, and soon eclipsed even his predecessor's influence. The battlefield had exposed Edward's weakness, but the court would show how dangerous that weakness could become. Edward II had lost one favorite in blood. He would not lose the next so easily. In 1316, Hugh Despenser the Younger, a sharp-minded noble with royal connections and insatiable ambition, began his quiet ascent. Through calculated loyalty and the strategic marriage to Eleanor de Clare, the king's niece, he embedded himself at the heart of power. By 1318, he was royal chamberlain. By 1320, he was the kingdom's shadow ruler. What followed was not governance but exploitation. Hugh used his closeness to the king to seize lands, manipulate lawsuits, and strip wealth from widows and rivals. Even his own family became targets of his greed. The nobility, still raw from the scars of Gaveston, watched in horror as the cycle repeated. Only this time it was worse. The Despensers, father and son, did not flatter power. They wielded it. With Edward as their shield, they built a regime of coercion, corruption, and vengeance. Nobles were dispossessed. Justice bent. Fear spread like plague. By 1322, the barons had risen in rebellion. Their defeat at Boroughbridge brought temporary peace, but at a terrible price. Edward had chosen Despenser over his kingdom, and in doing so, he ensured that his own downfall would be as complete and as brutal as his favorites' rise. Once a humiliated queen, Isabella of France now became something far more dangerous, a woman with a cause. In 1325, she was sent to her native France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV, but once across the Channel she refused to return. Her message was clear: not while the Despensers still ruled her husband and England. In exile, Isabella shed the veil of submission. No longer merely a royal consort, She forged a new identity as a political operator and avenger. At her side stood Roger Mortimer, a baron who had once escaped from the Tower of London. Their alliance, both strategic and intimate, became the engine of rebellion. From the courts of France and the Low Countries, they gathered support. Exiled nobles, mercenaries, and foreign sympathizers pledged loyalty. Letters passed in secret. Gold changed hands. Ships were armed. In public, Isabella claimed she fought for her son, the young Edward III. In truth, she fought for her throne and her vengeance. When they landed in England in September 1326, it was with a small army, but a tidal wave of support. Nobles defected. Towns surrendered. The Queen had returned, not as consort, but as conqueror. The hunted had become the hunter. The invasion was swift, but its impact was thunderous. In September 1326, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer landed on English soil with only a modest force, but the kingdom welcomed them as liberators. Years of dispenser tyranny had broken the nobility's loyalty and the people's patience. As cities opened their gates and barons raised their banners, Edward II and the dispensers fled westward, dragging the royal treasury behind them. But flight could not save them. On October 27th, Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured at Bristol, his execution immediate and savage. He was hanged in full armor, then beheaded and quartered, his remains scattered as a warning. For Hugh the Younger, worse awaited. Captured with the king near Neath, he was dragged to Hereford and subjected to one of the most grotesque public executions in English history, castrated, disemboweled alive, then beheaded and quartered. His screams, it is said, echoed through the crowd like a curse. Edward, powerless and alone, was brought to Kenilworth. There, under pressure from Parliament and his enemies, he abdicated on January 25, 1327, in favor of his 14-year-old son. The king who had ruled by favoritism now had no favorites left, only enemies, and none willing to save him. After his forced abdication, Edward II was no longer a king, he was a liability. Stripped of his crown, his dignity, and his defenders, he was moved under heavy guard to Berkeley Castle. There, behind thick stone walls and locked iron doors, began a slow descent, not into death, but into something crueler, erasure. At first, his imprisonment was measured. He was allowed servants, modest comfort, and letters. But the presence of Hugh Despenser's memory still clung to him, and to his captors. That was intolerable. As rumors of rescue plots swirled, his conditions worsened. He was kept in squalor, exposed to the cold, and deprived of human contact. His captors, Sir John Maltravers and Sir Thomas Gurney, are said to have subjected him to humiliation, forcing him to ride without trousers, allowing vermin to infest his bedding, and denying him even basic cleanliness. His royal name meant nothing now. He was not a guest. He was a ghost in waiting. The man once draped in ermine and crowned in gold now lived in silence, his mind unraveling. There would be no trial, no final audience, only whispers in corridors, and awaiting death. For a king who once ruled by desire, his prison was designed to destroy his very sense of self. The night of September 21st, 1327, is etched into legend, but shrouded in silence. In the deepest hours, two men allegedly entered Edward II's cell at Berkeley Castle. They carried no blade, no poison. What they brought was something darker, a horn tube and a red-hot iron. According to later chronicles, they pinned the former king beneath pillows, muffled his screams, and inserted the instrument of torture into his body, burning him from within, leaving no visible wounds. It was a murder cloaked in symbolism, meant to punish not just the man, but the sin his enemies believed he embodied. But did it happen? No contemporary record describes the method. The gruesome tale appears only decades later, in the Chronicle of Geoffrey le Baker, a text written under a king eager to demonize his father's killers. To some historians, the tale reeks of political theater, not truth. Other possibilities abound: smothering, starvation, or even simple neglect. Some go further still, suggesting Edward escaped, replaced by a corpse, and lived out his days as a hermit abroad. What we know is that a body was buried, a tomb raised, and a legend born. Whether fact or fabrication, the death of Edward II remains one of history's most haunting riddles. In 1330, 3 years after Edward II's supposed death, a letter arrived at the court of his son, Edward III. It came from an Italian priest named Manuel Fieschi and contained an astonishing claim. Edward II had not been murdered at Berkeley Castle. He had escaped. According to the Fieschi letter, a servant had died in his place. The former king fled through Ireland and France, eventually settling in Italy, living humbly as a hermit. The letter even described a secret meeting between father and son years later, unrecorded, unproven, but tantalizing. Historians remain divided. Some dismiss it as political fiction, crafted to destabilize Mortimer's regime or ease Edward III's guilt. Others point to circumstantial evidence, sightings of a Welshman at European courts, and inconsistencies in the funeral records. What the Fieschi letter offered was not just a theory, it was hope, legend, and political intrigue rolled into one. If true, it would rewrite a king's death. If false, it only deepened the shadow that already hung over that fateful night at Berkeley. On December 20th, 1327, a royal funeral was held at Gloucester Abbey. The body, whoever it truly belonged to, was embalmed, adorned, and entombed beneath an ornate alabaster effigy. Edward II, dead or vanished, had been transformed into memory. The tomb was magnificent. It bore the face of a serene king, unmarred by torture, untouched by scandal. No hint of humiliation or horror, only dignity carved in stone. It became a place of pilgrimage, a royal monument wrapped in silence. Politically, the burial served a purpose. It closed the book on a dangerous question. With Edward declared dead, Isabella and Mortimer could rule without the threat of a living king, but their grip would not last. In 1330, Edward III seized power, executed Mortimer, and imprisoned his mother, avenging the father whose end remained a national wound. The tomb still stands today, visited by those drawn to the tragic tale. Beneath its quiet surface lies not only a body, but a question. Was this the resting place of a murdered monarch, or a decoy for a king who slipped away? Stone endures. Stories survive. And Edward II, in death as in life, remains both enigma and echo. Centuries after his death, Edward II found a second life, not in history books, but on the stage. In the late 16th century, playwright Christopher Marlowe transformed the fallen king into a tragic figure. His Edward II was not merely a monarch undone by politics, but a man destroyed by passion, betrayal, and desire. Marlowe's version, though veiled in poetic ambiguity, left little doubt. Edward's downfall was inseparable from his love for his favorites. Audiences watched a king alienated by his court, tormented by power, and undone by the very emotions that made him human. In productions that followed, the infamous red-hot poker scene was often staged. Gruesome, theatrical, unforgettable. Modern historians have continued to wrestle with Edward's image. Was he a tyrant or a victim? A negligent ruler or a man crushed by circumstance? The debate has shifted from condemnation to complexity. In time, Edward became more than a failed king. He became a symbol, a figure onto whom generations projected their fears, prejudices, and evolving understanding of love, power, and legitimacy. His legacy was shaped not only by chroniclers, but by artists, scholars, and an audience eager to find meaning in his suffering. Edward II's fall was more than a political collapse. It was a rupture in the very fabric of medieval kingship. In 1327, for the first time in English history, a crowned monarch was formally deposed. The divine right of kings, once unassailable, had been challenged not by foreign invaders, but by his own wife, nobles, and parliament. That act would echo across centuries, resurfacing in the downfalls of Richard II, Charles I, and beyond. But Edward's legacy reaches further still, entangled with the question of identity. His close, possibly romantic relationships with Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despencer became fuel for scandal in his lifetime, And for centuries, the language of his downfall was steeped in accusations of unnatural love and moral failure. His sexuality, real or perceived, became inseparable from his political demise. This intertwining of queerness and catastrophe became a recurring narrative in European history. Edward II's fate helped shape a cultural pattern. That deviation from sexual norms in the halls of power leads inevitably to ruin. Yet with time, perspectives shift. Today, Edward is revisited not as a caricature of failure, but as a human figure, tragic, complex, and ahead of his time. His legacy is not just about what he lost, but what his story continues to reveal.